When the phone rang in the middle of the night, I knew it wasn't good news. Calls at that hour rarely were, but this one held an urgency I'd felt only a handful of times in my career. I was told to pack for an indefinite stay, that a flight would be ready in less than 3 hours. No details, no explanations, just a location, Goiania, Brazil. They only said the words contamination and containment. My mind raced as I packed. Radiation containment, a reactor failure, a leak. None of it added up. Goiania wasn't a city with nuclear facilities. It took everything I had to quell my nerves as the flight took off into the pre-dawn sky, racing against time, toward a city that would soon become synonymous with disaster. Stepping off the plane felt like crossing into another world. Goiania was a ghost city. I felt my own footsteps echo against the empty terminal walls as I was escorted to an emergency vehicle. Police lights flashed as we raced down eerily vacant streets, a sight that chilled me more than any warning could. The first briefing was held in a hastily assembled command center. They explained how the contamination began with a stolen piece of equipment, a medical device abandoned when the clinic closed that contained a capsule of Cesium-137. I could feel my heart pound as they spoke. Cesium-137. That meant serious, irreversible radiation damage for anyone exposed. In my hands, they placed photographs, snapshots of people who had come into contact with the device. A woman holding a glowing dust in her hands, children with it smeared on their skin like chalk. It was surreal, almost like a nightmare. Only this was real. These people were now our responsibility, and the entire city had unknowingly entered a deadly game with an invisible killer. The team split up to cover as much ground as possible, mapping contamination zones and identifying exposed individuals. My first stop was a modest home near the center of town. As I entered, I was struck by a faint bluish glow on the floor, barely visible in the dim light. In that moment, I felt my hands begin to tremble. I had read about this. The telltale blue glow of cesium, a visible sign of radioactivity. But seeing it here, staining the tiles of someone's living room, brought the horror into sharp, immediate focus. How many people had already walked through that glowing dust, unaware of the danger? In the back room, I found a mother and her 2 children lying on makeshift beds, their faces pale, their bodies visibly weakened. I could tell they hadn't slept in days. The mother's voice faint as she told me about the dust that her children had played with, how they had all gotten sick afterward. I wanted to help them, to do anything I could, but all I could offer were hollow reassurances and my presence, a stranger in a hazmat suit, there to tell them they would have to leave everything behind. From that house, I moved to another and another. Each family's story was similar, yet each filled me with a fresh wave of dread. In one home, I saw a young man clutching a piece of the device as if it were some kind of treasure. He told me how he'd found it, how he'd been fascinated by the glow. The way he spoke, excited, almost reverent, made me want to shake him, to make him understand the irreversible harm he'd done to himself. But I stayed calm, knowing that soon enough his body would remind him of the consequences. I began keeping a mental map of the city in my head, a mental web of contamination radiating outward from the clinic. It spread through families, across neighborhoods, each new site revealing more horror. Glowing powder on children's toys, a pillow dusted with cesium, plants and animals that had absorbed the deadly substance. The invisible tendrils of radiation were everywhere, coiled around every object, every person. As the days passed, the physical toll on me and my colleagues became apparent. We were all losing sleep, feeling the effects of constant exposure, no matter how many precautions we took. My headache is intensified, a dull pounding that became a permanent fixture, worsening each time I donned my gear and stepped into another contaminated site. My mind felt like it was splintering under the weight of what we were uncovering. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the faces of the people we had to turn away, knowing they were beyond help. One night, I barely slept, haunted by the memory of a little girl with the cesium dust on her fingers, licking her hands, thinking it was candy. I'd never felt so powerless. At some point, containment efforts began to face pushback. People were scared, angry. They didn't want to leave their homes, their belongings. Some refused to listen to our warnings, accusing us of trying to take their homes away. Others broke down, begging us to save just one item, one memory. I remember one family that kept a ceremonial heirloom, something they said had been passed down for generations. It had been in contact with the cesium, and there was no way to decontaminate it. They pleaded with me. The father even offered me money. But the damage was irreversible. It was contaminated beyond saving, just like so many lives that had been touched by the cesium's reach. Then came word of a hidden family, relatives of the first woman who found the cesium, who hadn't come forward. They were terrified of the government, and no one had been able to locate them. The officials asked if I would go myself. By that point, I'd lost track of the days, my mind a haze of sickness and exhaustion. But I went. The house was silent when I arrived. Inside, I found a young girl, barely able to move, her skin covered in burns. Her mother looked at me with such desperation that I almost wished I hadn't come. They were beyond help, and I could tell they knew it. I spent the night with them, watching the girl as she slipped in and out of consciousness. The blue glow still lingered on her fingers, a sickening reminder of the poison that had seeped into her veins. Leaving Goiania was the hardest thing I'd ever done. I felt like I was leaving behind a piece of myself, along with all the people whose faces would haunt me for the rest of my life. As I boarded the plane, I couldn't shake the feeling that I, too, had been contaminated, not just physically, but mentally. Every sound, every flicker of light reminded me of the cesium. As we took off, I looked down at my hand and noticed a faint mark on my arm, a small bruise that hadn't been there before. The flight attendant brought me a glass of water, but the metallic smell made me set it down, untouched. I closed my eyes, trying to push the memories away. But deep down, I knew that Goiania would never truly leave me.